Sarah Martinez stepped out of the black sedan that had brought her to the sprawling military base. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete structures, and she could hear the distant sound of boots marching in formation. She adjusted her civilian clothes and picked up her briefcase. Taking a deep breath as she looked at the imposing entrance gates ahead, the 35-year-old woman had spent the last 15 years climbing the ranks of the military, earning respect through sheer determination and exceptional leadership skills. Her last assignment had been overseas, commanding a unit in one of the most challenging environments imaginable. Now, she was about to take on her biggest challenge yet, becoming the new base commander of Fort Harrison, one of the largest military installations in the country. Sarah had deliberately chosen to arrive in civilian clothing rather than her dress uniform. She wanted to observe the base operations without the immediate recognition that would come with her rank insignia. It was a strategy she had used before, allowing her to see how things really worked when people thought no one important was watching. As she approached the main security checkpoint, she noticed several soldiers standing at attention. The base was clearly well maintained, with fresh paint on the buildings and perfectly manicured lawns. Everything looked exactly as it should in the reports she had studied during her preparation for this assignment. The guards at the entrance were young, probably fresh out of basic training. They stood tall and alert, their uniforms crisp and their weapons properly secured. Sarah felt a sense of pride seeing these young men and women who had chosen to serve their country. She remembered being in their position many years ago, nervous and eager to prove herself worthy of the uniform she wore. She had received her orders just 3 weeks ago. The previous commander had been reassigned suddenly due to a family emergency, and headquarters needed someone with her experience to step in immediately. Sarah had accepted without hesitation, even though it meant leaving behind the team she had worked with for the past 2 years. The briefing documents had painted a picture of a base that was performing well but could benefit from fresh leadership. There had been some minor disciplinary issues and a few complaints about communication between different departments. Nothing major, but enough to suggest that the right leader could make significant improvements. Sarah had spent countless hours studying the personnel files, base layouts, and operational procedures. She knew the names of key officers, understood the current training schedules, and had memorized the various protocols that kept the base running smoothly. Preparation had always been one of her strengths, and she never walked into a new situation without knowing everything she could. Beforehand, as she walked closer to the checkpoint, she could see the guards beginning to notice her approach. One of them, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, straightened his posture even more and placed his hand near his weapon. This was exactly the kind of alertness she liked to see from security personnel. The base was home to nearly 10,000 personnel, including active duty soldiers, reserves, and civilian contractors. It served as a training facility for several different military specialties and housed important administrative offices for the entire region. Managing such a large operation required someone who could handle multiple priorities while maintaining the highest standards of military excellence. Sarah's reputation had preceded her to some extent. She knew that senior officers on the base had been briefed about her arrival and her background. Her previous assignments had included combat deployments, training commands, and staff positions at headquarters. She had received commendations for her service and had been selected for this position based on her proven ability to lead large organizations effectively. However, she also knew that respect had to be earned at every new assignment. Rank and reputation could open doors, but actual leadership required building relationships, understanding local challenges, and proving that she could make the right decisions when it mattered most. She was confident in her abilities, but she also understood that every base had its own culture and its own way of doing things. The morning air was crisp, and she could smell the distinctive combination of diesel fuel, fresh paint, and breakfast cooking in the distant mess halls. These were the familiar smells of military life, and they brought back memories of her own early days in service. She had started as a young lieutenant, uncertain about her abilities but determined to succeed in what was still largely a male-dominated profession. Over the years, She had encountered various forms of discrimination and doubt about her capabilities. Some of it had been overt, with colleagues questioning whether women belonged in certain roles. More often, it had been subtle assumptions about her limitations or surprise when she outperformed expectations. Each challenge had made her more determined to excel and to prove that leadership was about competence, not gender. Now, as she approached what would be her new command, she was curious to see how the base personnel would react to their new leader. She had heard through unofficial channels that many of the soldiers expected the new commander to be a man, possibly someone with a more traditional military background. The surprise would come soon enough, but for now, she wanted to see how the base operated when people thought no one was watching. Sarah reached the security checkpoint where 2 guards stood behind bulletproof glass. The first guard, Sergeant Johnson according to his name tag, barely looked up from his paperwork when she approached. The second guard, a younger soldier named Private Chun, glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the computer screen in front of him. "Good morning," Sarah said politely, reaching into her briefcase for her identification documents. "I need to access the base for an appointment with Colonel Williams." Sergeant Johnson finally looked up, his expression showing mild annoyance at being interrupted. He extended his hand without much interest, clearly going through the routine motions of checking credentials. When Sarah handed him her military identification card, his demeanor changed slightly. He looked at the card more carefully, then at her, then back at the card. "Ma'am, this says you're a colonel," he said, his tone suggesting he found this difficult to believe. "But you're not in uniform." "That's correct," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm here on official business." The sergeant studied her identification again, holding it up to the light as if checking for forgeries. Private Chun had stopped what he was doing and was now watching the interaction with obvious curiosity. Other soldiers in the area began to take notice of the conversation, though they tried to appear as if they weren't listening. "I'm going to need to verify this," Sergeant Johnson said, reaching for his phone. "We don't usually see officers in civilian clothes, especially not ones claiming to be colonels." Sarah maintained her composure, though she was beginning to understand that this might be more complicated than she had anticipated. "Feel free to call Colonel Williams' office. He's expecting me." While the sergeant made his phone call, speaking in hushed tones that Sarah couldn't quite hear, she observed the activity around the checkpoint. Soldiers were coming and going, some in uniform and others in civilian clothes. She noticed that male personnel in civilian attire were being processed quickly with minimal questions, while her presence was creating an unusual amount of scrutiny. "Ma'am," Sergeant Johnson said after ending his call, "Colonel Williams' office says they don't have any appointments scheduled with a Colonel Martinez today." This was puzzling, but Sarah realized what might have happened. Her appointment was likely listed under a different name or classification due to the sensitive nature of her assignment. The transition of command had been kept relatively quiet to avoid disrupting base operations before the official announcement. "There might be some confusion about the scheduling," Sarah explained. "Could you call the base commander's office directly?" "Ma'am, I can't just start calling offices because someone claims to be a colonel," Sergeant Johnson replied, his tone becoming more firm. "Especially when the identification doesn't match what we're seeing." Sarah felt a familiar frustration building. This wasn't the first time her appearance and credentials had been questioned, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. The fact that she was a woman in civilian clothes was clearly creating doubt about her legitimacy, despite having proper military identification. "What exactly doesn't match?" she asked, keeping her voice level and professional. "Well, ma'am," the sergeant said, glancing at Private Chun as if seeking support, "you just don't look like what we'd expect from a colonel. And showing up in civilian clothes without any advance notice seems unusual." Other soldiers had begun to gather nearby, pretending to be busy with their own activities while clearly listening to the conversation. Sarah could see some of them whispering to each other, and she caught fragments of their comments questioning why a woman was claiming to be a high-ranking officer. "I understand your caution," Sarah said, "but I do need to access the base. Perhaps you could escort me to the main administrative building where we can sort this out?" Ma'am, I'm sorry, but you're not allowed beyond this point without proper verification, Sergeant Johnson stated firmly. And right now, we can't verify your claim to be a colonel. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Sarah. Here she was, about to take command of this entire base, being turned away at the front gate by soldiers who would soon be under her command. She could have pulled rank more forcefully, demanded to speak to someone higher up the chain, or insisted that they contact specific offices that would confirm her identity. Instead, she decided to see how far this would go. It was becoming an interesting case study in how assumptions and biases could interfere with proper procedures. The guards had her valid military identification, but their preconceptions about what a colonel should look like were overriding standard protocol. So what you're telling me, Sarah said, is that despite having proper military identification, you're refusing me access to the base because you don't think I look like a colonel? That's not what I'm saying, ma'am, Sergeant Johnson replied, though his discomfort was becoming obvious. I'm saying that the identification seems unusual, and we need to verify it through proper channels. Private Chun finally spoke up. Sergeant, maybe we should call the military police office. They might be able to help verify the identification. This suggestion seemed reasonable to Sarah, though she was curious to see how the MPs would handle the situation. She had worked with military police units before and generally found them to be more thorough and professional in their approach to unusual situations. That sounds like a good idea, Sarah agreed. I'm happy to wait while you make whatever calls you need to make. As Private Chun reached for his phone, Sarah noticed a black SUV approaching the checkpoint. The vehicle had official government plates, and she could see someone in military dress uniform in the passenger seat. This might be exactly what she needed to resolve the situation, though she was beginning to think that the confusion might be more educational than inconvenient. The black SUV pulled up to the security checkpoint, and Sarah watched as a uniformed officer stepped out from the passenger side. She recognized him immediately from the personnel files she had studied. Major Richardson, the base's executive officer, was a 20-year veteran with an impeccable service record. He would definitely know who she was, even if the guards at the checkpoint DIDN T. Major Richardson approached the checkpoint with a purposeful stride, clearly wondering what was causing the delay. He glanced at Sarah briefly before addressing Sergeant Johnson. What's the situation here, Sergeant? Sir, this woman claims to be a colonel, but we're having trouble verifying her identification, Sergeant Johnson explained, handing over Sarah's military ID card. She's requesting access to the base, but the credentials seem questionable. Sarah watched Major Richardson's face as he examined her identification. She could see the exact moment when recognition dawned in his eyes. His expression shifted from casual curiosity to surprise, then to what appeared to be alarm as he realized what was happening. Sergeant, Major Richardson said slowly, do you know who this is? No, sir, Sergeant Johnson replied confidently. That's why we're trying to verify her identity. She doesn't look like any colonel I've ever seen. The major looked at Sarah, and she could see him struggling with how to handle the situation. She gave him a slight nod, indicating that she wasn't upset and was willing to let this play out a bit longer. She was genuinely curious to see how deep the assumptions and biases ran among the base personnel. What makes you think she doesn't look like a colonel? Major Richardson asked, his voice carrying a warning tone that Sergeant Johnson didn't seem to pick up on. Well, sir, the sergeant said, she's in civilian clothes. She's a woman, and she just showed up here without any advance notice. It seems suspicious. Private Chun shifted uncomfortably beside his supervisor, clearly sensing that something was wrong, but not sure what. Several other soldiers had gathered nearby, and Sarah could hear their whispered conversations, speculating about who she might be and why the situation was becoming so tense. I see, Major Richardson said. And you verified her identification how? We called Colonel Williams' office, but they said they didn't have any appointments scheduled, Sergeant Johnson explained. So we were about to call the MPs to help verify the ID. Sarah decided this might be a good time to speak up. Major Richardson, I appreciate the thoroughness of your security procedures. It's clear that these soldiers take their responsibilities seriously. The Major's eyebrows rose slightly at her diplomatic response to what was clearly a problematic situation. He handed her identification back to her and then turned to address the guards. "Gentlemen, I need you to understand something very important," he began. "Military identification cards are issued through a very secure process. When someone presents you with valid military ID, your job is to verify that the ID matches the person presenting it, not to decide whether that person looks like they deserve their rank." Sergeant Johnson's confidence began to waver. "But sir, the situation just seemed unusual. What seemed unusual about it?" Major Richardson pressed. "A military officer requesting access to a military base with proper identification?" The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and Sarah noticed that some of the more senior enlisted personnel in the area were beginning to look uncomfortable. It was becoming clear that something significant was happening, though most of them still didn't understand exactly what. "Sir, I was just following procedures," Sergeant Johnson said, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Actually, Sergeant, you weren't following procedures," Major Richardson corrected. "Procedures require you to verify identification, not to make judgments about whether someone looks like they deserve their rank. This is exactly the kind of bias that the military has been working to eliminate." Sarah could see Private Chun looking increasingly worried. The young soldier clearly understood that his supervisor had made a serious error, and he was probably concerned about being associated with it. She made a mental note to speak with him later about the importance of speaking up when procedures weren't being followed correctly. "I want both of you to think very carefully about what just happened here," Major Richardson continued. "You have valid military identification for a colonel, and you refused entry based on your personal assumptions about what a colonel should look like." The realization was beginning to dawn on Sergeant Johnson's face. His earlier confidence had completely disappeared, replaced by a growing concern about the implications of his actions. He looked at Sarah again, this time with a very different expression. "Ma'am," he said hesitantly, "if you're really a colonel ... "She is," Major Richardson confirmed firmly. "And that's not the most important part of this story." Sarah was impressed with how the Major was handling the situation. He was using it as a teaching moment rather than simply pulling rank and ending the confrontation. This was exactly the kind of leadership approach she hoped to see throughout the base. "The most important part," Major Richardson continued, "is that we have procedures for a reason. Those procedures are designed to be fair and objective, and they only work when we follow them without letting our personal biases interfere." The growing crowd of soldiers was listening intently now. Word was clearly spreading that something significant was happening at the main checkpoint, and people were stopping their activities to pay attention. Sarah realized that this unplanned incident was turning into exactly the kind of learning opportunity that could benefit the entire base. "Now," Major Richardson said, "I think we need to resolve this situation properly. Sergeant Johnson, I want you to process Colonel Martinez's entry according to standard procedures, and then I think we all need to have a conversation about what just happened here." Major Richardson's SUV drove through the base with Sarah as his passenger, passing rows of barracks, training facilities, and administrative buildings. The silence in the vehicle was heavy with unspoken tension. Sarah could see that the Major was struggling with how to address what had just happened at the checkpoint. "Ma'am," he finally said, "I want to apologize for what you experienced back there. That kind of behavior is completely unacceptable, and I assure you that we'll be addressing it immediately." Sarah looked out the window at the soldiers going about their daily activities. Some were in formation, others were maintaining equipment, and a few were clearly heading to or from training exercises. It was a well-functioning military base, but the incident at the gate had revealed some underlying issues that needed attention. "Major, what I experienced back there was actually quite valuable," Sarah replied. "It gave me insight into some challenges that we'll need to address together." Richardson glanced at her with surprise. He had expected anger, demands for disciplinary action, or at least frustration with how she had been treated. Instead, she seemed to be treating the incident as a learning opportunity. I'm not sure I understand. Ma'am, he said. Tell me, Sarah said. How often do you think female personnel on this base face similar assumptions about their capabilities or their right to be in certain positions? The question hit home, and Richardson was quiet for a moment as he considered the implications. I'd like to think it doesn't happen often, but after what I just witnessed, I'm not sure I would know if it did. They pulled up in front of the main administrative building, an imposing structure that housed the base commander's office and the primary staff functions. Sarah had studied the building layouts extensively, but seeing it in person gave her a better sense of the scale and complexity of the operation she was about to inherit. As they walked into the building, Sarah noticed the reactions of the personnel they encountered. Most of them seemed curious about who she was, especially since she was being escorted by the executive officer. A few nodded respectfully, probably assuming she was some kind of VIP visitor. Major Richardson, called out a voice from down the hallway. A woman in dress uniform approached them quickly. Sarah recognized Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Davis, the base's operations officer, from her personnel file. Colonel Davis, Richardson replied. I'd like you to meet Colonel Martinez. Lieutenant Colonel Davis extended her hand with a professional smile. Welcome to Fort Harrison, Colonel Martinez. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Sarah shook her hand, noting the firm handshake and direct eye contact. This was the kind of professional interaction she had been expecting all morning. Thank you, Colonel Davis. I've read about your work here, and I'm impressed with what you've accomplished. I hope your arrival went smoothly, Davis said, then noticed Richardson's expression. Is everything all right? We had an interesting situation at the main gate, Richardson explained diplomatically. It's been resolved, but it highlighted some issues we need to discuss. As they continued toward the commander's office, Sarah could see staff members beginning to realize that something significant was happening. Word was clearly spreading that the woman in civilian clothes being escorted by senior officers might be more important than anyone had initially assumed. They entered the outer office of the base commander, where several staff members were working at desks and computer stations. Master Sergeant Williams, the commander's senior enlisted advisor, looked up from his paperwork and immediately stood at attention. Good morning, sir, he said to Richardson, then looked questioningly at Sarah. Master Sergeant Williams, Richardson said, this is Colonel Martinez, our new base commander. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Everyone stopped what they were doing and stood at attention. Sarah could see the surprise and shock on their faces as they processed this information. Some looked embarrassed, probably wondering if they had failed to show proper respect earlier. At ease, everyone, Sarah said. I know my arrival is a bit unconventional, and I appreciate your professionalism. Master Sergeant Williams stepped forward. Ma'am, we weren't expecting you until later this afternoon. If we had known you were arriving early, we would have had proper arrangements in place. Actually, Sergeant, the timing worked out perfectly, Sarah replied. It gave me a chance to see how the base operates when people think no one is watching. She could see understanding dawn on several faces around the room. They were beginning to realize that their new commander had just experienced the base's security procedures firsthand, and it probably hadn't gone smoothly. I'd like to meet with the senior staff in 1 hour, Sarah announced. But first, I think Major Richardson and I need to have a conversation about what happened at the front gate. Lieutenant Colonel Davis looked confused. What happened at the front gate? Richardson cleared his throat. Our new commander was initially denied entry to the base because the guards didn't believe her identification was legitimate. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could see the shock and embarrassment on everyone's faces as they realized the implications of what had happened. Their new base commander had been turned away at the gate by their own security personnel. How exactly did that happen? Master Sergeant Williams asked, his voice carefully controlled. The guards made assumptions about what a colonel should look like, Sarah explained. They had valid identification, but they decided it must be fake because I didn't match their expectations. Lieutenant Colonel Davis shook her head in disbelief. Ma'am, I am so sorry that happened. That is completely unacceptable behavior from our personnel. Actually, Sarah said, it's going to become an excellent case study for how unconscious bias can interfere with proper procedures. We're going to use this incident as a teaching tool for the entire base. The staff members looked at each other with a mixture of relief and admiration. Their new commander wasn't demanding punishment or expressing anger. Instead, she was turning an embarrassing incident into an opportunity for improvement. Before we do anything else, Sarah continued, I want to make one thing very clear. I'm not here to blame anyone or to start my command with disciplinary action. I'm here to lead this base to the highest possible standards, and that means addressing issues constructively when we find them. She could see the tension in the room beginning to ease. The staff was starting to understand that their new commander was someone who focused on solutions rather than problems, on learning rather than punishment. The conference room filled quickly as senior staff officers arrived for the impromptu meeting. Sarah had changed into her dress uniform, and the transformation was remarkable. The same person who had been questioned and denied entry just hours earlier now commanded immediate respect and attention from everyone in the room. Colonel Thompson, the deputy commander, was the last to arrive. He had been off base during the morning's events, and was clearly trying to understand why an emergency staff meeting had been called. When he saw Sarah at the head of the conference table, his confusion was obvious. Ladies and gentlemen, Major Richardson began. I'd like you to meet Colonel Sarah Martinez, our new base commander. The room fell silent as the senior officers processed this information. Several of them had heard rumors about what had happened at the front gate. But seeing their new commander in uniform for the first time made the morning's event seem even more significant. Thank you all for gathering on short notice, Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority that her civilian clothes had somehow obscured earlier. I know my arrival has been unconventional, and I want to address what happened this morning directly. She could see the discomfort on several faces around the table. Word had spread quickly about the incident at the security checkpoint, and the senior staff was clearly concerned about how their new commander would handle the situation. This morning, I was denied entry to this base by security personnel who decided that my valid military identification must be fraudulent. Sarah continued. They made this determination based on their personal assumptions about what a colonel should look like. Colonel Thompson shifted in his seat. Ma'am, if I may ask, how exactly did that happen? Our security procedures should prevent that kind of error. That's an excellent question, Colonel, Sarah replied. The procedures themselves are sound. The problem was that personal bias overrode professional judgment. The guards saw a woman in civilian clothes claiming to be a colonel, and they decided that couldn't possibly be legitimate. Lieutenant Colonel Davis raised her hand. Ma'am, how do you want us to address this? Should we be looking at disciplinary action for the personnel involved? Sarah had been expecting this question, and she had given it considerable thought during the past hour. The easy response would be to demand punishment for the guards who had embarrassed her and the base. The better response would be to use the incident as an opportunity for meaningful improvement. I want us to think bigger than disciplinary action, Sarah said. This morning revealed a problem that probably extends far beyond the front gate. If our security personnel can make assumptions that override proper procedures, where else might similar biases be affecting our operations? The room was quiet as the officers considered this question. Major Richardson spoke first. Ma'am, are you suggesting that we might have broader issues with how personnel are treated based on assumptions about their capabilities? I'm not suggesting it, Major. I'm stating it as a fact that we need to address, Sarah replied. The question is whether we're going to tackle this challenge proactively or wait for more incidents to force our hand. Master Sergeant Williams, who had been invited to represent the enlisted perspective, cleared his throat. Ma'am, if I may speak freely, I think you're right. I've seen situations where personnel, especially women and minorities, have had to prove themselves repeatedly in ways that others don't. This admission seemed to open a floodgate of recognition around the table. Several officers nodded in agreement, and Sarah could see that they were beginning to understand the scope of the challenge. So here's what we're going to do, Sarah announced. First, we're going to conduct a comprehensive review of our procedures and training to identify where bias might be interfering with proper operations. Second, we're going to implement mandatory training for all personnel on recognizing and preventing unconscious bias. Third, we're going to establish clear reporting mechanisms for when people experience discrimination or unfair treatment. Colonel Thompson looked concerned. Ma'am, that sounds like a significant undertaking. Are you sure we want to make such major changes so quickly? Sarah had encountered this kind of resistance before. There were always people who preferred to avoid addressing difficult issues, hoping they would simply resolve themselves over time. Unfortunately, that approach rarely worked. Colonel, let me ask you this, Sarah said. If our security procedures failed to identify a real threat to the base, would you want us to take immediate action to fix the problem? Or would you prefer to wait and see if it happened again? I'd want immediate action, of course, Thompson replied. Then why would we treat a failure in our personnel procedures any differently? Sarah asked. The incident this morning revealed a weakness in our operations. As leaders, we have a responsibility to address weaknesses when we discover them. The logic was undeniable, and Thompson nodded his agreement. Around the table, Sarah could see other officers beginning to understand her perspective. This wasn't about political correctness or sensitivity training. This was about operational effectiveness and ensuring that all personnel could contribute their best work. Major Richardson, Sarah said, I want you to work with the training department to develop a comprehensive bias awareness program. Lieutenant Colonel Davis, I need you to review our evaluation and promotion procedures to identify potential points where bias might be affecting decisions. Master Sergeant Williams, I want you to establish a confidential reporting system for discrimination complaints. The assignments were clear and specific, giving each leader a concrete role in addressing the challenges that the morning's incident had revealed. Sarah could see that her staff was beginning to understand that their new commander was someone who identified problems and took decisive action to solve them. Finally, Sarah said, I want to address the 2 guards from this morning's incident. They're going to become our first case study in how to learn from mistakes rather than simply punishing them. They'll receive additional training, and they'll help us develop better procedures for the future. The meeting continued for another hour as Sarah outlined her vision for the base and her expectations for the senior staff. By the end, it was clear that Fort Harrison was about to undergo significant changes under its new commander's leadership. 3 months later, Fort Harrison had become a model for other military installations across the country. The changes that Sarah had initiated following her first day's experience had transformed not just the base's procedures, but its entire culture. What had started as an embarrassing incident at the front gate had evolved into a comprehensive program that other commanders were now studying and implementing. The morning formation was different now. Sarah stood before nearly 10,000 personnel, but the atmosphere was markedly changed from her first day. There was an energy and engagement that hadn't existed before. A sense that every person on the base understood their value and potential contribution to the mission. Sergeant Johnson and Private Chen stood in the front row of the formation. Both had completed intensive training programs and had become advocates for the new procedures. Johnson had been promoted to staff sergeant and had been selected to help train security personnel at other bases. Private Chun had been accepted into the officer candidate program, his potential finally recognized and encouraged. 3 months ago, Sarah addressed the formation. This base experienced an incident that could have been swept under the rug and forgotten. Instead, we chose to use it as a catalyst for positive change. Today, I want to share with you what we've accomplished together. She looked out at the sea of faces before her, representing every branch of service, every rank, and every demographic group. The diversity was the same as it had been 3 months ago. But now that diversity was being leveraged as a strength rather than merely tolerated. Our bias awareness training has been completed by 100% of base personnel, Sarah announced. More importantly, our climate surveys show that 93% of you feel that you're treated fairly, and have equal opportunities to advance based on your performance. The improvement was remarkable. When Sarah had arrived, less than 60% of personnel had felt confident about fair treatment. The change hadn't happened overnight, but it had happened through consistent effort and leadership commitment at every level. Major Richardson, now Lieutenant Colonel Richardson, after an early promotion, approached the podium. His leadership during the transition had been exceptional, and he had become one of Sarah's most trusted advisors. "The commander has asked me to share some specific results from our new approach," he announced. "Our promotion rates are now statistically identical across all demographic groups, with advancement based purely on performance and potential. Our retention rates have improved by 15%, particularly among personnel who had previously felt undervalued or overlooked. These weren't just feel-good statistics. They represented real improvements in operational effectiveness. When people felt valued and fairly treated, they performed better, stayed longer, and contributed more to the mission." Lieutenant Colonel Davis stepped forward to present the most significant news. "This morning we received word from headquarters that Fort Harrison has been selected as the pilot site for the new military-wide equality initiative. Other bases will be sending teams here to learn from our experience and implement similar programs." The applause from the formation was genuine and enthusiastic. The personnel understood that they had been part of something important, something that would have impact far beyond their own base. What had started as a local problem had become a solution with national implications. Sarah took the podium again, looking out at the faces that had become familiar over the past 3 months. She had gotten to know many of these people personally, learning about their backgrounds, their challenges, and their aspirations. They were no longer just statistics on organizational charts, but individuals whose potential she was committed to maximizing. "When I first arrived here," she said, "I was denied entry at the front gate because someone made assumptions about what a leader should look like. Today, I want every person in this formation to understand that leadership comes in many forms, and every one of you has the potential to lead." The truth of this statement was already being demonstrated across the base. Personnel who had previously been overlooked were now being given opportunities to show their capabilities. The officer candidate program had expanded to include candidates from backgrounds that had historically been underrepresented. Leadership development programs were identifying and nurturing talent from every corner of the base. Master Sergeant Williams approached the podium carrying a folder. "Ma'am, I have some letters here from personnel who wanted to share their experiences with the changes we've implemented." Sarah nodded for him to proceed. These personal testimonials had become an important part of understanding the impact of their initiatives. "This first letter is from Specialist Rodriguez," Williams read. She writes, "For the first time in my military career, I feel like my ideas are heard and valued. I've been selected for advanced training that I never thought would be available to someone like me. The base has changed, and it's changed my entire outlook on my future in the military." Similar stories had been repeated hundreds of times over the past 3 months. Personnel who had felt marginalized or overlooked were now finding opportunities they had never imagined possible. The base hadn't just become more fair. It had become more effective by utilizing all available talent. "This transformation didn't happen because of one person or one incident," Sarah told the formation. "It happened because everyone here committed to being part of the solution. You chose to examine your own assumptions, to question unfair practices, and to create a better environment for everyone." As the formation dismissed, Sarah watched the personnel returning to their duties with a sense of purpose and engagement that was visible in their stride and their interactions with each other. The base that had once turned her away at the gate had become a place where everyone's potential could be realized. The black sedan that had brought her to Fort Harrison 3 months ago was waiting to take her to headquarters for a briefing about expanding the program to other installations. But this time, she knew she would have no trouble gaining entry wherever she went. More importantly, she knew that the changes they had implemented here would help ensure that no one else would face the assumptions and barriers that she had encountered on that first morning. The transformation was complete. but the work would continue. Real change required constant attention and commitment. But Fort Harrison had proven that it was possible to turn a moment of embarrassment into an opportunity for lasting improvement.